Start with Dr. Peterson. Mr. Peterson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. And thank you again for being here.
As well, I would like to start by expressing my appreciation for the privilege awarded to me to testify here today. It really is an honor to be asked to do so. I'm not here to talk about January 6th or about any particular threat, insurrection, or protest, political or ideological, real or imaginary. I'm here to talk about the already extant and expanding collusion of government and corporation in restricting the individual.
Welcome back to A News Network. Today we will listen to Jordan Peterson. He is in Washington and he has some insights on what's going on with the woke culture. Let's have a listen.
Freedom and autonomy upon which the productive, generous, and stable psyche, economy, and state are themselves necessarily founded. I'll begin my comments, therefore, in the most general terms to shed light on the mounting problem. There are now 700 million CCTVs in China under the rule of the Communist Party. The system to which those electronic eyes are attached is the most complete state apparatus of surveillance yet imagined, with the ability not only to recognize faces at a distance, but gait itself when facial features are hidden or obscured. Such capability can and will soon be augmented to the point where the movement of eyes themselves, monitored by high-resolution and intelligent cameras, will soon be sufficient to identify any aware and active party. The demented, naive, and prideful engineers who so enthusiastically helped build this system call it Skynet, after the rogue and all-seeing technology that took such a dreadfully wrong turn in the famous science fiction movie Terminator series, featuring artificially intelligent robot intelligences hell-bent on protecting themselves by destroying humanity. The name also references a well-known Chinese phrase describing the reach of the divine itself. The net of heaven is vast, yet it misses nothing, which aptly describes the capabilities of the new state apparatus. The system is integrated with the so-called Chinese social credit system, which awards its involuntary participants with a score indicating their compliance with the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, allowing for full control over access to everything they possess electronically. Most ominously, their savings and their access to travel. Certainly, all modern means of travel, but increasingly as the electronic gates come up, even by walking. If you're Chinese or a visitor, your access to the world can be reduced to zero if your social credit score falls beyond an arbitrary minimum. This allows you purposefully to be shut out of all activities that can be virtualized. And in a rapidly virtualizing world, this increasingly means all activities: driving, shopping, working, eating, finding shelter, even fraternizing with friends and family, as merely being in the presence of someone with a low social credit score means that your own score can be lowered. This has also opened up the opportunity for the government to extract slave-like labor from its citizens, so burdened, as the donation of free work to the state still constitute one means by which erring Chinese men and women can increase their score and remain part of human society. This is precisely the payment system most desired by the most tyrannical, not the work for me and benefit thereby that constitutes the contractual arrangement undertaken by free and sovereign citizens, but the work for me and I will lift the deprivation I imposed that has always been the leitmotif of the slaver. Why is any of this relevant to people in the West? Well, because the technology that the Chinese Communist Party employs is an extension of Western technology. Because we already fell prey to the terrible temptation of lockdown employed by that state in the face of hypothetical crisis once and in the very recent past, because we're walking step by step in the same direction, partly because of the hypothetical convenience of universal and automatic recognition of identity, and partly because any problem whatsoever that now confronts us can easily be used to justify the increasing reach of the security and nanny state. It is said that Stone Age people, first confronted with cameras and their resultant photographs by modern anthropologists, objected to having their images captured as they feared the captivity of their souls. It turns out that such fear was prescient. The images that we leave behind while navigating virtual space are such close duplicates of our actual selves that the capture of our essence is at this point all but guaranteed. We all now have our doppelgangers. We all live so much in the virtual world in consequence of our purchasing habits and modes of electronically mediated communication that our very selves have become reducible to a frightening degree to data, the modern equivalent of our footprint, with the same data making up an image of our identity, an identity which can be and is increasingly bought and sold by the invisible corporate brokers that still mostly use it to sell us what we so desperately and carelessly and conveniently want.
There's a lot of people that accept the digital ID, and I think it's a lot of older people that know and see what it's about, and that's really the scary part. A lot of people think it's sort of nice to have the phone tell them that they might want to buy something or whatnot. But the fear is, even like with electric cars, is that it takes away your freedom because the government can track where you are driving, and a gas car, they don't have that freedom to track. And if you start going over, use too much carbon footprint, they just might start turning it off, like digitally turn it off. And I've had it too where I've gone to a gas station and the Visa doesn't work, or gone to a food court and they don't accept Visa because the internet's down. So all that can happen. Let's continue.
But it can also be used to track, monitor, and punish everything we do and say. Behavioral scientists facilitate this process with their reprehensible nudging, the practice of pushing people in a given ideologically determined direction by manipulating invisible incentives behind the scene. Corporations track purchasing decisions, developing algorithms that with increasing accuracy track our patterns of attention and action, allowing for the prediction of what might next be most enticing, doing so not only to offer us what we want, but to determine and shape what we need. Governments can and are colluding with these corporate agents to develop a picture not only of our actions, but of our thoughts and words, so that deviation from the desired end can be mapped, rewarded, and punished. The development of a digital identity and currency is nothing more than the likely end consequence of such inclinations, and the combination of both can and will facilitate the development of a surveillance state, the scope of which optimistic pessimists of totalitarianism such as George Orwell could scarcely imagine. The new AI systems, which are so rapidly emerging, do nothing but increase this danger, providing for the possibility of a super surveillance whose scope exceeds anything that mere unaugmented humans could imagine, while also making it certain that even the perceptions that in the real world shape our attitudes, conduct, and personality can be manipulated to the degree that we will not even be able to see a reality outside which that has been constructed by the superstate, the ultimate fascist collusion between gigantic self-interested corporations and paranoid, security-obsessed anti-human governments. We're already selling our souls to the superstate for the purposes of immediate gratification, while being enticed to do so by fear-mongering
Mr. Chairman, could the
ideologues.
witness be asked to summarize, please?
And do I have my 5 minutes or do I not?
You've gone over 5
Oh,
minutes.
I'm sorry. I can certainly.
If the witness could summarize, we're always a little lenient with the time. If you could summarize
I'll
it in
take
a few
10 more
seconds.
seconds.
Sure.
With increasing ability to monitor not only the actual attention patterns and behaviors of its citizens, but to predict those that are most likely, the persecution of even potential crime becomes ever more likely. If you have nothing to hide, you will have nothing to fear, will be the slogan commandeered by those most likely to turn to surveillance to protect and control. What was the famous Soviet totalitarian joke attributed to Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police? Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Those words were true enough in the time of Stalin's KGB, and the police were secret enough then as well. But that's nothing compared to what we can and likely will produce now. A police so secret that we will not even be able to detect their comprehensive and subtle activity. Monitoring crime so pervasive that everyone under the dictates of the system will have something to hide
Regular
and
order,
much to
Mr.
fear.
Chairman.
Yep. The gentleman's time is expired. We now go to Mr. Knight for your statement.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be asked to testify. My name is Brian Knight, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where my research focuses on financial regulation, including its use as a tool of broader policy. Americans write the story of their lives in their bank accounts. To function in a modern economy, Americans must create a trail of records that can reveal their movements, their religious and political beliefs, their sexual preferences, health conditions, whether they are likely to own a gun or have had an abortion. The government can access these records without meaningful due process or the person ever knowing it happened. It's perhaps unsurprising then that efforts to expand the use of financial surveillance are increasing. While potentially well-meaning, these efforts present a pressing threat to Americans' privacy and a glaring weakness in our constitutional order that should be addressed. A recent example of this is federal law enforcement and financial institutions collaborating to share financial records of an unknown number of Americans after January 6th. While publicly available information is limited, it appears this was done to identify suspects based on their movement, political and religious beliefs, and whether they owned a firearm. These searches use broad categories, many of which relate to lawful, sensitive, and constitutionally protected activity. This was apparently done under the Bank Secrecy Act, which allowed the information to be provided without a warrant or any outside check, and prevented the targets of the search from being told it happened. We only know it occurred because of the testimony of whistleblowers and the work of this subcommittee. We do not know how often similar techniques were used in the past and if their use is currently ongoing. To add insult to injury, it's unclear that the data was even useful and was removed by the FBI, though only after it had been shared with at least 2 field offices. Now, it isn't surprising that after a serious crime and fearing more violence, that law enforcement would use every tool available. However, the way this appears to have happened is emblematic of the serious defects in our protection of Americans' privacy enabled by financial surveillance. Sadly, this isn't the only recent example of the expansive use of financial surveillance. There are currently efforts to distort the financial system to turn it into a tool to track constitutionally protected behavior, including firearms purchases. Advocates of this approach argue it will help prevent violence, especially mass shootings. To be sure, this is a noble aspiration. However, it is unlikely the effort will accomplish its goal, while imposing significant costs to privacy, trust, and the ability of our anti-money laundering system to fulfill its legitimate ends, as well as encouraging a broader escalation of surveillance. As discussed in more detail in my written testimony, our problem is that our financial system provides a convenient, almost one-stop shop where, without the constitutional protections that apply to similar information elsewhere. It's too easy for the government to obtain a comprehensive and retrospective, though not perfect, picture of a person's life without due process. A further problem is that the Bank Secrecy Act is opaque by design. Banks are prohibited from alerting the target of a report. This prevents most citizens whose information is shared from challenging the law in court, removing one of the core means we use to check government excesses. Congress has also been kept in the dark about the effectiveness of the BSA, despite requiring reports revealing the system's effectiveness be provided by law. In fact, a bank apparently even refused to share information with this subcommittee based on the Bank Secrecy Act's confidentiality requirements. It even appears that the agencies that administer the BSA and use the BSA lack a full or even partial picture of how the information is used, how useful it is, and how long it takes for government to act on it. We have these problems due to a combination of technology, bad law, and bad Supreme Court precedent, the latter of which thankfully may be finally coming under question, but we cannot and should not rely on the court. As discussed further in my written testimony, Congress should reform our financial surveillance system, especially the Bank Secrecy Act, to restore proper protection for Americans' privacy. Importantly, and I want to emphasize this does not mean that law enforcement could not access the information. Rather, it means that the access would be done pursuant to due process. To be clear, I'm not here to impugn anyone's motives, but good intentions can pave the road to hell. And our history is unfortunately replete with times when, motivated by real threats, we have violated the rights of Americans, often without benefit, and to our later regret. We should learn from those mistakes and get off the path I fear we're currently taking, which will provide us with neither liberty nor security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. Mr. Tedesco, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, and distinguished members of the Select Subcommittee, good morning. It's an honor to be here. My name is Jeremy Tedesco, and I serve as Senior Counsel and Senior Vice President of Corporate Engagement for Alliance Defending Freedom. Yesterday, this subcommittee released documents that show that the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network colluded with big banks to monitor their customers to identify domestic threats, and shared a list of so-called hate groups published by the hyper-partisan Institute for Strategic Dialogue to help them do so. Echoing the discredited and morally bankrupt Southern Poverty Law Center, the ISD list includes ADF, where I work, as well as other mainstream religious and conservative organizations like Family Research Council, Liberty Council, Pacific Justice Institute, and Ruth Institute. Simply put, the federal government appears to have swept up Christian and conservative organizations in its domestic terrorist dragnet. This Orwellian surveillance of American citizens has no place in a free society. Neither does the federal government's weaponization of the financial industry against peaceable religious and conservative groups. Our story is just one of many, demonstrating the increased rise and threat of viewpoint-based debanking. In 2023, Bank of America closed the long-standing bank account of Indigenous Advance Ministries, a Christian nonprofit that helps impoverished widows and children in Uganda. The bank also closed the account of a local Tennessee church that donates to that ministry. The bank claimed it no longer wanted to serve their business type, and that Indigenous Advance exceeded the bank's risk tolerance. The bank's abrupt decision created a logistical nightmare for Indigenous Advance and inflicted real harm on the populations they serve. The list goes on. J.P. Morgan Chase debanked the Arkansas Family Council for being high risk and never provided a credible reason for canceling the account of former U.S. Senator Samuel Brownback's organization, the National Committee for Religious Freedom. And Wells Fargo denied payment processing to the pro-life group, the Ruth Institute, because it was a hate group. These debanking stories and many more highlight the systemic risk of political and religious bias that pervades the financial industry, particularly at the largest banks and payment processors. These institutions maintain reputational risk policies that allow them unfettered discretion to punish customers who have, in their view, problematic political or religious views. Many also have prohibitions on hate speech and intolerance that require the institution to make subjective and value-based judgments on a customer's viewpoint. Both types of policies are vague and ambiguous, sweep in broad swaths of content, chill constitutionally protected speech, and erode economic freedom. Worse, government regulators can all too easily wield their outsized power over financial institutions to pressure them to leverage reputational risk policies, hate speech policies, and similarly vague language against disfavored views, all with virtually no public accountability. Financial institutions, in turn, can hide behind that same shield to discriminate without ever explaining it to the customer, regardless of whether the action was prompted by government pressure. There is ample evidence of the two collaborating to censor views they don't like, whether it was the DOJ and FDIC in Operation Choke Point, the state of New York and NRA versus Vulo, a case currently pending before the Supreme Court, or the FBI and Treasury in recent revelations from this subcommittee. Each of these incidents show that the government can and will weaponize the financial marketplace against Americans for political benefit. Several factors exacerbate this risk. Banking regulators have expansive authority over banks' day-to-day operations and decisions. Both the government and banks have shown an unsettling willingness to increase data collection practices around customers' speech and religious exercise. And most banking supervision is shrouded in secrecy. The government props up many of these institutions with bailouts, subsidies, and an anti-competitive chartering system. Due in part to these benefits, the top 5 banks control over 50% of the market for deposit accounts. This only elevates the need to ensure viewpoint neutrality in the provision of financial services. Congress should take action. This is an issue that we should all agree on and deserves our utmost attention. We cannot continue to let law enforcement, regulators, and banks that are too big to fail run roughshod over our First Amendment freedoms. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tedesco. Mr. Michel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. I'm Norbert Michel, Vice President and Director for Cato's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives, and the views that I express today in this testimony are mine. They should not be construed as representing any official position of the Cato Institute. In my testimony, I argue that it is long past the time for Congress to reaffirm Americans' constitutional rights that guarantee an expectation of financial privacy, particularly those secured by the Fourth Amendment. Excuse me. The Bank Secrecy Act and the anti-money laundering framework that the government has developed around it are unnecessary, wasteful, and harmful. The typical American is not a terrorist, a criminal, or a tax cheat, and does not want to live among such individuals. The typical American does, however, recognize that the Constitution protects all Americans from unreasonable persecution and limitless invasions of privacy. And I'd like to make 3 main points in support of my position. First, Congress should not have passed the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. It was a much broader bill than the legislation that its original sponsor promised to deliver, and its relationship to the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution was controversial enough to spur several legal challenges, 2 of which ended in split decisions at the U.S. Supreme Court during the 1970s. Further, the bill was so controversial that it spurred Congress to pass multiple bills, including the Right to Financial Privacy Act, just 8 years after passing the Bank Secrecy Act. It did so with the explicit intent of countering the very financial surveillance that the Bank Secrecy Act itself created. Unfortunately, the 1978 bill was so watered down with 20 different exceptions that it failed to live up to its name. As a result, financial institutions remain responsible for both record-keeping and reporting requirements, and law enforcement has the authority to obtain Americans' financial records without first obtaining a valid search warrant. The so-called third-party doctrine, born largely out of those Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s, excuses this legal status by effectively claiming that bank customers have no expectation of privacy from the government once they give their information to the bank. Much like the dissenting justices of those cases, I believe this logic defies all reasoning. There is simply no sphere of our lives that would remain free of government involvement, surveillance, and control if it were taken seriously. Second, the agencies themselves have failed to demonstrate how the Bank Secrecy Act regime provides a net benefit, and it has merely created an information overload for federal agencies through excessive reporting. In 2022, for instance, financial institutions were required to file over 26 million reports with the federal government on customer activity. And even though it's been decades since the first suspicious activity report was filed, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network still cannot provide data that explains how law enforcement even uses those reports. These 2 points are just the tip of the iceberg. Difficult as it may be to believe, there are virtually no convictions to show for all this regulating and reporting. Depending on the federal crime data that we use, the per conviction cost ranges anywhere from $7 million to $178 million. And those figures do not include any implicit cost of violating citizens' right to financial privacy, banks' decisions to terminate or limit customers' accounts, or banks' refusal to provide financial services to certain customers. Finally, personal and financial privacy are pillars of life in a free society. The American system of government was designed, with good reason, to ensure that individuals do enjoy a private sphere free of government involvement, surveillance, and control. Unless there is a reasonable suspicion that someone has committed a crime or conspired to commit a crime, people should generally be free to live their lives unmolested and unsurveilled by the government. That is literally why the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects Americans from unreasonable searches and seizures. And Americans' financial records should not be an exception to that rule. It is, of course, healthy to debate what private companies should be allowed to do with the data they collect from customers. But no American should confuse that debate with why we have the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects us from unwarranted government persecution. And that is why Congress should amend the Bank Secrecy Act and restore Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. Thank you. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Michel. We now go to Mr. Fanone for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to answer questions regarding the events that occurred at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. I would like to tell you that I've forgotten some of the events of that day, or that my recollection is not as clear as it once was. But that would not be the truth. The events of January 6th are as vivid to me now as when they occurred over 3 years ago. While the physical scars of that day have healed, the emotional scars remain. We are a government of laws, not of men. I spent nearly 2 decades as a law enforcement officer trying to enforce the law. My career began in the United States Capitol as a Capitol Police officer and ended when called upon as a Metropolitan Police officer to protect the Capitol against a mob of people. While much of my career involved dangerous encounters with violent criminals, that experience was unlike anything I had experienced. I'm here to tell you what happened to me on that day and what I saw and heard happening to fellow officers. As for me, I was violently grabbed, restrained, beaten, tased, all while being called a traitor to my country. I was at risk of being stripped of and killed with my own firearm as I heard chants of kill him with his own gun. My body camera video captured the violence of the crowd directed towards me during those very brutal moments. The portions of the video I have seen remain extremely painful for me to watch, but doing so is crucial to fully understand what really happened that day and the extent of the violence. During those moments, I remember thinking that there was a good chance that I could be killed, and my thoughts were of my children who may lose their father. While I'm here to share my experience, I know that hundreds of other law enforcement officers responded that day. They were outnumbered and acted with tremendous bravery to protect the Capitol and all those present inside who serve our country. Those officers have sustained injuries, both physical and emotional. They too have been scarred, some visible and some that cannot be seen. I think of them often, like my partner, Jimmy Albright, who dragged me to safety while I was unconscious and who drove me to the emergency room, though injured himself. I think then about Commander Ramey Kyle, who, like so many of us, self-deployed to the Capitol, who organized the defense of the Lower West Terrace Tunnel. His rally cry, "Do not give up the door," echoes through my thoughts. I think of all the brave men and women, newly minted officers, and those nearly retired who responded to the call of service that day in defense of our nation. Those who are still on the front lines each and every day to make our city safe and protect our institutions of government. I appear today not to give my opinion or analysis or advocate for some action, but simply to bear witness. I leave whatever actions to be taken to your wisdom and where we go as a nation to the American people. I have no agenda or affiliation. I do not come with malice in my heart, but only a deep love of this country, which I know is shared by so many others, both young and old, both Republican and Democrat. And in the process of speaking, more importantly, listening to each other, hopefully we can come together as one nation with shared values of wanting tomorrow to be better than today, with the hope and confidence that we do each and every day, is for the singular purpose of trying to provide a better life for our children and our children's children in generations to come. I thank you for your invitation to be here today and the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Mr. Fanone. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanone, I want to express.
It's truly amazing how, for example, the socialism in Canada is so mirroring of what communism is, and that they can't see it? Or is it just that it's just natural for them? The control and the power is what they cherish so much, and that just happens to mirror what communism is, and they just can't see what's in front of them. Hopefully in Canada they have an election soon, because Trudeau, I think, is about to go. Let's move on.
But I guess we'll get to it.
Gentlelady yields back. Without objection, all of their opening statements will be included in the record. We now introduce today's witnesses. Dr. Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, author, and professor emeritus at the University of Toronto. He previously taught at Harvard University and McGill University. He has published more than 100 scientific papers, hosts a popular podcast, hosts public lectures across the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe, and offers online programs to help consumers better understand their personalities and themselves.